Welcome to video 3. In this video I'm going to focus on the communication skill of open questions. In video 1 you went through an appreciation of the tendency that people have with respect to entering into conflict or differences from an adversarial orientation. That right and wrong or win and lose mentality. Video 2 we focused on how to make that shift from the adversarial to one that's more collaborative. Now, in order to facilitate that conversation moving forward is we need to be able to ground ourselves in some really productive and effective communication skills. Our starting point is going to be centered around curiosity. And the catalyst of curiosity is the use of open questions. Remember that when we're working with the other party and we're interested and we're curious, it actually becomes a diffusing skill. So with that being said, let's start with what's the difference between an open and a closed question. Closed questions are all those questions that many of us, I believe, are soft-wired more to speak to or to raise. And those questions are things like can, could, will, won't, is, isn't, have, haven't, should, shouldn't. Lots of different kinds of closed questions. Now when we ask those questions, we're often going to get a response, or could get a response, which is a yes or no answer. The other piece to think about is that when we're asking closed questions is that they're not really what I would describe as genuinely curious about the other person's perspective. In fact, we could suggest that, or I could suggest that closed questions that we raise are often from our own experiences or the assumptions we have about what's going on for the other party in terms of their behavior. That, in fact, then leads to this whole piece around now the assumptions we make in terms of what's happening, which now creates a space in which people now start to feel as though they're being led down a particular path. Or that perhaps even us unconsciously are trying to lead someone down a particular path in terms of our beliefs or assumptions we have about their behavior. That's only going to create more defensiveness and reactivity in the other party. The other component related to that is that if we're trying to engage in a collaborative conversation, it's helpful to have them also participate in an equal manner. Closed questions really put us in a position in which we're doing a lot of the heavy lifting in that conversation. And what I mean by that is that we're actually asking questions in the hopes that the one question we're going to ask is actually going to now start to present an opportunity for this person to disclose all the information we're looking for. Kind of like closing your eyes and throwing darts at a dartboard, hoping that that one is going to hit the target. So rather than that, is that we want to shift away from controlling the information, controlling the outcome in terms of what we believe the outcome is, controlling the person's response to what it is we have to say, not wanting them to feel as though they're being led through a conversation, to one that's more collaborative and open. We now start to think about the use of open questions. Open questions start with what, how, when, where, who, and although why is an open question, I would suggest that why questions often create sort of this defensive justification, rationalization response. It's even said that why questions create lies and alibis. So rather than that, if you can, change your why question to a what or how question. There's less tendency for the party to become reactive or defensive around a why question. And the reason many people have this tendency to be more defensive or reactive to a why question is often based on our own family history and experiences in terms of the questions we were asked as kids. So imagine being asked questions such as, why did you pull the cat's tail? Why'd you spill your juice? Why didn't you get your homework done? Why didn't you clean your room? And the list can go on and on. And so with those kinds of questions, as kids, we often felt as though we needed to defend the questions that were being asked of us. So here's the opportunity in which we're going to move away from that why question tendency to one that's going to be more open. It's the historical experiences that people have that now, as we talked about in video 2, can now come to life in these conflicted conversations. So trying to move away from something that could potentially trigger someone, I think, is a helpful consideration with respect to a strategy. So now we've dealt with that in terms of what are open questions. Now it's the application of putting those into practice. When we ask open questions, what we're trying to do is to provide a space in which they can self-disclose. They're basically in the driver's seat of the information they want to provide. With that being said, Part of the experience of being able to be in this process is being able to have patience. Sometimes our brain can go so fast is that when we ask an open question, we may not realize, but we've actually asked a number of open questions at the same time. This becomes compound questions. Try to just focus on one question at a time. In all likelihood, if we're utilizing compound questions, they're probably going to ask the last question we asked, and really what we wanted is information from the first one. So let's slow ourselves down. The next consideration in terms of asking open questions is also this piece around being able to make sure that we're keeping our open questions open. We can ask a wonderfully crafted open question and then close it off. A simple example is, so what was your thought in terms of the process of moving through the project? I'm thinking it was either this or that. Now we've created this wonderful open question, but now we've given them a choice between two, what we believe are sort of the decisions that they made around this particular question we're asking. We're controlling the information again. The final consideration in terms of asking open questions is also this piece around space, creating an opportunity for the person to think about the question that's being asked. So when we ask a question, sometimes there is this belief that they have to respond within 2 or 3 seconds. If we're moving with that kind of process mentality, we may inadvertently then ask another open question because they're taking too long, we believe, in answering that one. Perhaps we're thinking we're making them feel uncomfortable. Perhaps we're just looking for more sort of efficiency or being able to answer a question more quickly. And so we go on to a different question. And then we can do that again and again. Again, it's patience, allowing the person to think. Some of us are more introverted in terms of our processing. It means it take a little bit more time internally to think about the question. Sometimes it may be based on culture. So with that being said, from more of a Western perspective, in terms of process and efficiency, we may be moving through those questions quite quickly. From a different culture, we may need time to think, to reflect, to really consider my response. That's going to take time. That can bang up against my Western perspective in terms of how I think we should be moving through these conversations. So slowing it down, recognizing that sometimes this takes time, and just, again, allowing the person to be in control of their thoughts and the messages they wanted to provide us. Those are the basics around open questions. Now, 2 considerations related to open questions are also the strategies around tracking information and probing. Tracking is a skill that really lets us to consciously be aware of the information we're receiving from the other party. So when we ask an open question, what we're listening for from a tracking perspective is, did they answer the question or not? If they didn't, and they start to deviate away from something else because maybe something else is more important they need to share with us, they may not be listening as effectively as we'd like them to, allow that to happen, acknowledge that, paraphrase that, and then refocus back to your question. The other piece as it relates to then thinking about this whole dynamic of questioning and being able to provide that space for people is, again, just recognizing that when they're providing us information, we want to make sure that we're getting the information that we believe is relevant. So going slowly is going to be helpful. Now, when we talk about moving away from tracking information, so we're clear about the information we're getting, we're going down the path, it's recognition that sometimes people aren't giving us all the information we're looking for. Maybe it's just a soundbite. With that, we now consider the application of probing. What probing means is that we're staying on the response that they've provided. And rather than thinking of another open question, we can simply say something like, tell me more, say more about that. Those are probing statements. What that allows for is for this individual to then elaborate more on the initial response to our open question. That's really helpful in terms of understanding specifically what's going on, creates a greater opportunity for them to self-express, but we can also understand what their interests and drivers are in terms of their experience, which is really helpful when we start to look at problem solving in terms of negotiation. So with that, we're now focusing in on a real clear path of understanding for the other party. So we've talked about moving away from closed questions. And one thing I'd like to say about closed questions before I do move on is that closed questions do have utility. It's just making sure that when we're asking the question, we're clear about what kind of question we need to ask. Are you picking the kids at 3 after school today? Yes or no is helpful to understand who's going to be picking up the kids. But if we're wanting to get more information, more depth, not in control, allowing the other one to self-express, more collaborative, more engaging, we're moving to open questions. What, how, when, where, who. Trying to avoid the why, adjusting the why to what or how. And then as we ask those open questions, we want to make sure it's one at a time, going slowly, taking our time, listening for the information, allowing space for them to process, to digest, to formulate a response. And then from there, we're also considering the use of being able to track the information, making sure it's coming in terms of response that we've asked related to the question. And then we're also probing more deeply. Say more, tell me more about that. Becomes a very efficient way of being able to move through that conversation. In the next video, we're going to talk a little bit more about actively listening and paraphrasing, because those are critical elements that also support open questions as well too. We don't want this feeling like an interrogation in terms of what our experience is with the other party. Paraphrasing becomes a helpful tool. So we're going to expand upon that related to open questions. Now, moving forward, what I think might be helpful is for you to now start to think about and listen to the kinds of questions you hear others ask. Listen to the kinds of questions you ask. And if you're able to start to identify, was that a closed question or was that an open question? Is that anytime you hear a closed question is in your head, try to change it to an open one. You could even, for example, say to yourself, for 10 minutes today over lunch, all I'm going to really consciously do is ask open questions. So really try to ground yourself in what does it mean to be genuinely curious and ask those open questions. Remember, the more conscious we are in terms of what we're doing, the more ability we have to assess that, the more opportunity we have to be able to then build and craft our communication skills. So pay attention to those questions. Recognize that there's a difference between the open and closed, and what is it that you want to work on. So with that being said, I want to thank you for your time, and I look forward to in the next session in which we're going to talk more about actively listening and paraphrasing. Thanks so much. Take care.